December 18th, 1944. The narrow roads above Stavelot, Belgium. A column of German King Tiger tanks, the most heavily armored vehicles in the entire Wehrmacht, grinds to a halt, one after another, along a winding forest road, their fuel tanks running dry in the middle of the most ambitious armored spearhead of the entire Ardennes offensive. Engine after engine falls silent within minutes of one another, drivers pumping useless throttles as gauges needle toward empty, the massive 68-ton hulls settling motionless on a narrow road that offers no room for the column to maneuver around its own stalled vehicles. An entire armored task force reduced, in the space of a single morning, from Germany's most feared spearhead to an immobile traffic jam strung out through the Belgian forest. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper commands this column, a task force built around the finest tanks and most battle-hardened crews, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Field, tasked with punching through American lines and reaching the Meuse River before Allied reinforcements can organize a coherent defense. Peiper, already among the most decorated and most feared young commanders in the entire Waffen-SS, has built his reputation across years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, through a combination of genuine tactical brilliance and a ruthlessness toward both enemy combatants and civilians that has already, by the winter of 1944, earned him a level of notoriety within the German military establishment that few officers of his relatively junior rank can claim. For 2 days, Peiper's tanks have driven deeper and faster into Allied territory than any other German unit in the entire offensive. A spearhead so successful that Adolf Hitler's entire strategic gamble to reverse the course of the war has come to depend almost entirely on this single armored column reaching its objective. Hitler himself, briefed regularly on the progress of the offensive's various spearheads, follows reports of Peiper's advance with particular interest, recognizing that the entire northern shoulder of Wacht am Rhein depends on exactly the kind of rapid, unrelenting momentum Peiper's column has demonstrated in these opening days, a momentum that stands in stark contrast to the more sluggish progress other German formations are making elsewhere along the offensive's broad front. Now, along the twisting roads climbing out of the Meuse River valley, Peiper's Tigers are stalling out one by one, their engines falling silent not because of American guns, but because the fuel that should have kept them moving simply is not there. Crews climb from their immobilized vehicles into the bitter December cold, staring back down roads choked with the rest of their own stalled column, radios crackling with increasingly urgent and increasingly futile requests for fuel that every officer receiving them understands, even before any formal reply arrives, is unlikely to materialize in time to matter. What happens over the following days, as one of the most feared armored formations in the entire German army finds itself stranded, exposed, and increasingly desperate, will determine not just the fate of Kampfgruppe Peiper, but the outcome of Hitler's entire last offensive in the West. American commanders, still uncertain in these opening days precisely how far German forces intend to press their advance, watch reports of Peiper's stalled column with a cautious, still-forming recognition that the single greatest immediate threat to their own defensive position may be solving itself through nothing more dramatic than a simple failure of supply, a possibility almost too fortunate to fully credit until the evidence accumulates beyond any reasonable doubt. To understand why a single column running dry on fuel carries such catastrophic weight, you have to understand the fundamental gamble built into the entire German plan for the Ardennes offensive. By December 1944, German fuel reserves have been strained to a breaking point by years of Allied strategic bombing against synthetic fuel production facilities and the accumulated losses of a war fought on multiple exhausting fronts. The systematic Allied bombing campaign against Germany's synthetic oil plants, intensifying dramatically throughout 1944 as American and British air forces increasingly targeted This specific industrial vulnerability has reduced German fuel production to a fraction of what the Wehrmacht's mechanized forces require to sustain large-scale offensive operations, a crisis so severe that entire panzer divisions across multiple fronts had already been forced to curtail training exercises and operational movements simply to conserve what fuel reserves remained available. Hitler's planners, keenly aware that Germany simply does not possess sufficient fuel stockpiles to sustain a prolonged offensive of the scale required to reach the Meuse and beyond, have built their entire operational plan around a desperate assumption that advancing German columns will capture American fuel depots along their route of advance, refueling their tanks with captured Allied gasoline, rather than relying on Germany's own inadequate reserves. Field Marshal Walter Model and other senior commanders responsible for executing Hitler's offensive had privately expressed reservations about the fuel situation during the planning process, aware that the entire operation's logistics rested on a foundation considerably less certain than the confident timetables circulated to subordinate commanders suggested. Concerns that Hitler's own insistence on proceeding with the offensive, regardless of these logistic uncertainties, ultimately overrode. It is a plan that treats enemy supply dumps not as a fortunate bonus, but as an absolutely essential pillar of the entire offensive's logistics. A gamble that leaves German commanders with almost no margin for error if those depots prove harder to capture or emptier upon capture than German intelligence has projected. German logistics officers, calculating the fuel requirements for an offensive of this scale against the actual reserves Germany's increasingly strained wartime economy could provide, arrive at figures that, even under the most optimistic assumptions about captured Allied fuel, leave little genuine margin for the kind of delays, detours, or unexpected resistance that any real military campaign inevitably encounters once actual combat begins to diverge from the clean lines drawn on planning maps. Peiper's own force represents the sharp end of this gamble in its most concentrated form. His task force, drawn from the most capable elements of the entire 1st SS Panzer Division, embodies exactly the kind of concentrated offensive power German planners believed necessary to punch through American lines quickly enough to reach the Meuse before Allied reinforcements could organize an effective defensive response. Kampfgruppe Peiper, spearheading the advance of the 1st SS Panzer Division as part of Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, includes some of the most powerful armor in the entire German arsenal. King Tiger tanks weighing nearly 70 tons apiece, consuming fuel at a rate that makes the entire formation's mobility almost entirely dependent on either an uninterrupted supply chain stretching back into Germany itself, or the successful capture of American fuel stocks along the route. The King Tiger, officially designated the Panzerkampfwagen 6 aus B, represents the pinnacle of German heavy tank development, its thick, sloped armor rendering it nearly invulnerable to frontal fire from the vast majority of Allied tank and anti-tank guns. But this protection comes at an enormous cost in weight and fuel consumption. The vehicle's massive engine burning through gasoline at a rate that leaves it with an operational range measured in mere tens of miles under the demanding conditions of sustained combat operations across difficult terrain. Peiper, 29 years old, and already one of the most notorious commanders in the entire SS for the ruthless aggression that has defined his combat record since the invasion of the Soviet Union, drives his column forward with a relentless energy that has, in the offensive's opening 2 days, produced genuine, alarming success against scattered and often outmatched American defenders. His personal command style, forged through years of Eastern Front combat where speed and audacity had repeatedly overcome numerically superior but less tactically flexible Soviet formations, now guides a spearhead operating under conditions and against an opponent considerably less predictable than the enemy his prior experience had prepared him to anticipate. American units confronting Peiper's advance in these opening hours, many of them inexperienced formations, caught entirely off guard by the scale and speed of the German assault, find themselves overwhelmed by an enemy force whose King Tigers and supporting infantry press forward with a discipline and aggression that contrasts sharply with the confused, often panicked American response the offensive's initial surprise has produced across much of the northern Ardennes sector. By December 17th, Peiper's forces have already committed one of the most infamous atrocities of the entire war: the massacre of American prisoners near the crossroads at Bulge, an act that will forever attach itself to Kampfgruppe Peiper's name and reputation, regardless of whatever tactical achievements or failures follow in the days ahead. More than 80 American soldiers, captured after a brief engagement and gathered into an open field near the Bulge crossroads, are gunned down by SS troops in an act of deliberate mass murder, that word of which spreads rapidly through American lines in the days that follow, transforming Kampfgruppe Peiper from merely a dangerous tactical threat into a symbol of the atrocities American soldiers now understand themselves to be fighting against, a psychological shift that hardens American resistance against Peiper's advance, even as it provides no immediate tactical advantage against his continued progress. Pressing onward through Stavelot and toward the Amblève Valley, Peiper's column has advanced with a speed that briefly threatens to unravel the entire American defensive position in this sector of the Ardennes, American commanders scrambling to organize resistance against a spearhead that seems, for these first critical days, almost unstoppable. First Army Headquarters, receiving increasingly alarming reports of Peiper's rapid advance, begins diverting reinforcements and supporting units toward the threatened sector with an urgency reflecting genuine concern that this single German column, if left unchecked, could achieve exactly the kind of breakthrough capable of unraveling the broader American defensive position across the entire northern shoulder of the Bulge. But success on this scale has consumed fuel at a rate Peiper's own logistics simply cannot sustain. Every mile of rapid advance, every engagement fought and won against American resistance, every detour forced by blown bridges or unexpected opposition draws down fuel reserves that Peiper's own supply columns, struggling to keep pace with an advance moving faster than German logistics planners had originally anticipated, prove increasingly unable to replenish, a widening gap between consumption and resupply that no amount of tactical success on the battlefield itself can close. What Peiper does not yet know, as his column presses deeper into Belgian territory on December 18th, is that the American fuel depots his advance depends on capturing are either being destroyed by retreating American forces before his tanks can reach them, or simply lie beyond his column's reach given the routes and timetable his advance has actually followed. As his King Tigers begin sputtering to a halt along the roads near Stavelot, Peiper faces a crisis that no amount of tactical skill or battlefield aggression can solve through combat alone. This is a crisis fundamentally different in character from anything Peiper's considerable combat experience on the Eastern Front has prepared him to handle, a problem that cannot be resolved through aggressive maneuver, superior gunnery, or the disciplined coordination of infantry and armor that has defined every previous engagement of his career, but only through the arrival of fuel that, as each passing hour makes increasingly clear, is simply not coming. Will Kampfgruppe Peiper find the fuel it desperately needs to continue its drive toward the Meuse, or is Hitler's entire gamble about to run dry in the forests above a single Belgian river valley? Every hour that passes without resupply narrows Peiper's options further, transforming a tactical question about the next objective on his advance into an existential one about whether his Kampfgruppe can survive at all once American forces fully recognize the vulnerability his stalled column now represents. Peiper's crisis begins to crystallize in the early hours of December 18, 1944, as his lead elements push toward Stavelot itself, a small town whose bridge over the Amblève River represents one of the last remaining obstacles between his column and the open roads leading toward the Meuse. American engineers and the scattered defenders holding the town, recognizing the strategic importance of denying Peiper's armor an intact crossing, fight a desperate delaying action through the town's narrow streets, buying precious hours, even as Peiper's Tigers and supporting infantry gradually force their way through toward the bridge itself. Small groups of American engineers and hastily assembled infantry, armed with little more than bazookas and whatever demolition charges they can improvise on short notice, contest every building and street corner, their resistance measured not in ground held, but in minutes and hours purchased against a German timetable that can absorb almost no further delay without the entire offensive's momentum beginning to unravel. Peiper's forces seize Stavelot's bridge, largely intact, by midday, a tactical success that should open the route toward the vital fuel and supply depots American forces maintain near the town of Spa, stockpiles large enough, if captured, to solve Peiper's fuel crisis many times over and potentially sustain his column's advance all the way to the Meuse. The Spa depots represent, by some accounts, several million gallons of stored fuel, a quantity that would not merely solve Peiper's immediate crisis, but potentially fuel the entire remainder of his advance and beyond, making their capture, for a brief window on December 18th, the single most consequential prize available anywhere along the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive. Yet even as Peiper's column crosses into Stavelot, his fuel situation has already deteriorated to a genuinely critical point. Individual vehicles within the column beginning to run dry, forcing crews to siphon fuel from less essential vehicles into the tanks and half-tracks Peiper deems most critical to continuing the advance. A desperate, improvised triage that buys the column only a few additional hours of mobility rather than solving the underlying crisis. Crews performing this improvised refueling work under constant threat of American artillery and air attack, siphoning gasoline by hand from truck to tank, in a process that consumes precious time and manpower, even as it produces only a fraction of the fuel the column's overall consumption demands. A stopgap measure that every officer involved understands cannot substitute indefinitely for a genuine, reliable supply of fuel reaching the column through proper channels. American commanders, recognizing the catastrophic consequences of allowing Peiper's forces to reach the massive fuel depots near Spa, order those stockpiles destroyed rather than risk their capture. Engineers, setting fire to millions of gallons of gasoline that could otherwise have solved Peiper's crisis entirely. The decision to destroy rather than attempt to evacuate the depot's contents reflects the genuine urgency American commanders feel about the threat Peiper's advance represents, calculations made within a matter of hours rather than days, weighing the operational value of the fuel to American forces against the catastrophic consequences of allowing that same fuel to fall into German hands and potentially extend Peiper's advance for dozens of additional miles. This single decision, the deliberate destruction of exactly the fuel supply Peiper's advance has been counting on capturing, represents one of the most consequential moments of the entire Ardennes campaign, a choice made by American logisticians and commanders who understand precisely what is at stake if that fuel falls into German hands, and who choose to deny it to the enemy, even at the cost of losing supplies their own forces might otherwise have used. The billowing black smoke rising from the burning depot becomes visible for miles across the surrounding countryside, a plume that, to American forces monitoring Peiper's advance from a distance, represents tangible proof that the single greatest prize available to the German column has just been permanently placed beyond his reach, even as the same smoke, to German scouts observing it from a distance, delivers an unmistakable and deeply unwelcome message about exactly what has just been lost. With the Spa depots destroyed and now unreachable, Peiper's column continues pressing forward through December 18th and into the following days, advancing through Trois Ponts and towards Stoumont in a desperate bid to maintain momentum despite a fuel situation growing more critical with every mile traveled. Peiper himself, according to accounts from surviving officers within his own command, recognizes almost immediately, upon receiving word of the Spar depot's destruction, that his column's prospects have shifted dramatically for the worse, yet continues pressing the advance regardless, understanding that halting in place offers no better alternative than continuing to search for any remaining fuel source that might yet extend his column's mobility even a few additional miles. At Trois Ponts, American engineers achieve another critical delay, demolishing bridges across the Amblève and Salm rivers, moments before Peiper's lead tanks can cross, forcing the column onto a longer, more circuitous route that consumes precious fuel reserves the formation can no longer afford to waste. A small detachment of American engineers, numbering barely a dozen men and armed with nothing more than demolition charges and a single anti-tank gun, manages to delay Peiper's entire column at Trois Ponts long enough to complete the bridge demolitions, a disproportionately consequential delaying action that historians studying the campaign have since credited as one of the single most impactful small unit actions of the entire Ardennes offensive, purchasing precisely the kind of additional delay Peiper's rapidly deteriorating fuel situation could least afford to absorb. Peiper, watching his options narrow with each passing hour, presses his exhausted, increasingly fuel-starved column towards Stoumont, still hoping, against mounting evidence, that some combination of captured supplies or resupply from German lines can restore his advance's momentum before it grinds to a complete and irreversible halt. Radio communications between Peiper's forward positions and German rear echelon logistics units grow increasingly desperate throughout these days. Urgent requests for fuel resupply met with responses that make clear the broader German supply network, already strained by the demands of the entire offensive's multiple simultaneous spearheads, simply lacks the capacity to push adequate fuel forward to a column advancing as fast and as deep as Peiper's has. By December 19th and 20th, American forces, including elements of the 30th Infantry Division and the 82nd Airborne Division, rushed into the sector to contain Peiper's penetration, begin closing in around the increasingly isolated German column, American artillery and infantry attacks intensifying against a formation whose own mobility is now catastrophically compromised by the fuel crisis unfolding within its own ranks. American artillery observers directing fire against positions Peiper's forces can no longer easily reposition away from, exploit the column's newfound immobility with growing confidence, shelling stationary German positions with an intensity that would have been considerably riskier to sustain against a mobile, still maneuvering enemy formation capable of rapidly repositioning in response. King Tiger after King Tiger, each one representing an enormous investment of German industrial resources and irreplaceable trained crews, sits immobilized along the roads and in the small villages Peiper's column has fought so hard to seize, transformed from the spearhead of Hitler's entire offensive into stationary targets awaiting American artillery and tank destroyers to finish what the fuel crisis has already begun. Crews inside these stranded vehicles, unable to reposition or withdraw, can do little beyond using their still functional weapons to defend their immediate positions, transforming what had been a fast-moving armored spearhead into something closer to a series of isolated, static strongpoints, each one increasingly vulnerable to the kind of concentrated, methodical American assault that a mobile force could otherwise have avoided through maneuver alone. The moment of true crisis arrives around La Glaise and Stoumont, where Peiper's remaining mobile forces find themselves increasingly surrounded, cut off from any realistic prospect of resupply or reinforcement. American forces tightening a noose around a column that, only days earlier, had represented the single greatest threat to the entire Allied position in the northern Ardennes. La Glaise itself becomes the final defensive pocket for Peiper's remaining combat-capable forces, a small Belgian village whose stone buildings offer at least some defensive advantage even as the surrounding fields and roads, now firmly under American observation and fire, deny any realistic prospect of the surrounded German force escaping intact with its remaining armor. Peiper, assessing a situation that has deteriorated from spearhead to encirclement in the span of little more than 72 hours, faces an agonizing decision that will determine whether his surviving men escape or share the fate of the tanks they can no longer move. Abandon the King Tigers and other heavy vehicles his column can no longer fuel, and attempt to fight his way back to German lines on foot, or continue clinging to positions that American forces are steadily, inexorably closing in upon. On the night of December 23rd into December 24th, 1944, Peiper makes the decision that effectively ends Kampfgruppe Peiper's role in the offensive. He orders his remaining survivors to abandon their immobilized vehicles entirely and attempt to break out on foot back toward German lines, leaving behind dozens of tanks, half-tracks, and other vehicles that had, only a week earlier, represented one of the most powerful armored formations in the entire Wehrmacht. The decision does not come easily. Peiper, according to post-war accounts from surviving officers, wrestles for days with the question of whether to hold his positions around La Glaise in hopes of relief from other German forces still advancing elsewhere along the front, or to accept that no such relief is coming and that every additional day spent defending an increasingly untenable pocket only adds to the eventual toll in dead and captured men. Approximately 800 men, all that remain of a force that had numbered nearly 6,000 soldiers and more than 100 armored vehicles at the offensive's outset, slip away from La Glaise under cover of darkness, abandoning their wounded who cannot make the journey, and leaving behind an armored graveyard that American forces will spend the following days documenting and salvaging. The breakout itself proves harrowing even for men who had survived days of encirclement and combat, small groups moving through freezing terrain and hostile territory with minimal supplies, several groups encountering American patrols during the journey, and forced into further fighting even as they attempt to reach the relative safety of German-held ground. A final, grueling ordeal that stretches on for days after the initial decision to abandon La Glaise. The scale of material loss Kampfgruppe Peiper suffers proves staggering by any measure. Nearly all of the formation's tanks, including a substantial portion of the King Tiger heavy tanks that represented some of the most advanced and expensive armored vehicles Germany's wartime industry could still produce, are abandoned intact or lightly damaged, immobilized not by American gunfire, but by the simple absence of fuel to move them. Each King Tiger represented not merely a substantial expenditure of Germany's dwindling steel and industrial capacity, but months of specialized manufacturing time and the accumulated training investment of a crew whose skills, honed through years of combat experience, could not be replaced through any accelerated wartime production schedule, regardless of how much raw material German factories could still muster. American intelligence officers and ordnance specialists, examining the abandoned column in the days following Peiper's breakout, find vehicle after vehicle sitting with full or partially full ammunition racks and functioning weapons systems, tanks that could easily have continued fighting had they possessed nothing more than the fuel needed to maneuver and engage. The scene at La Glaise, when American forces finally move in to secure the area, presents an almost surreal tableau of military power rendered entirely impotent. King Tigers and Panthers sitting in orderly rows or scattered along roadsides exactly where their fuel had run dry, main guns still loaded, machine guns still belted with ammunition, everything intact except the one resource that would have allowed any of it to matter. The human cost of Kampfgruppe Peiper's collapse extends across both sides of the fighting that raged through the Amblève Valley during this critical week. American forces, including the 30th Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, and supporting armor and artillery units, suffer significant casualties, containing and ultimately destroying Peiper's stranded force, fighting through difficult, compartmentalized terrain against an enemy that, even immobilized, continued fighting with the same ruthless determination that had characterized its advance. American infantry assaulting the pocket around La Glaise and Stoumont face SS troops who, understanding the fate likely awaiting any survivor of a unit already infamous for the Bulge massacre, fight with a desperate intensity that makes even the final days of the encirclement extraordinarily costly for the American forces tasked with closing the trap. German losses among Peiper's original force prove catastrophic. The roughly 800 survivors who eventually reached German lines, representing a loss rate exceeding 80% of the Kampfgruppe's original strength, a devastating reduction in exactly the kind of experienced, battle-hardened SS Panzer personnel that Germany's increasingly desperate wartime manpower situation could least afford to lose. Many of the men lost were among the most experienced soldiers remaining in the entire 1st SS Panzer Division, veterans of years of combat on the Eastern Front, whose accumulated tactical knowledge and battlefield instincts represented exactly the kind of irreplaceable human capital that no amount of accelerated wartime conscription or hasty training could adequately restore, a loss that would be felt across the division's subsequent operations for the remainder of the war. The strategic consequences of Kampfgruppe Peiper's fuel-driven collapse extend far beyond the immediate tactical destruction of a single German task force. As the spearhead of the entire 6th Panzer Army's advance, Peiper's failure to reach the Meuse River represents one of the clearest and most consequential failures of Hitler's entire strategic gamble. A collapse that ripples backward through the broader German offensive as commanders further back in the advance find themselves forced to reassess an operational plan that had assumed Peiper's column would already be threatening the Meuse crossings by the time follow-on forces arrived to exploit whatever breakthrough his advance achieved. Sepp Dietrich himself, overseeing the broader 6th Panzer Army offensive from his own headquarters, receives news of Peiper's collapse as confirmation of a pattern already unfolding across much of his army's front. Other spearheads, similarly stalling against determined American resistance, and the same underlying logistical constraints that had doomed Peiper's own advance from the very beginning. Without Peiper's continued momentum, the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive loses much of its remaining strategic coherence, contributing directly to the broader failure of Wacht am Rhein to achieve any of its original, ambitious objectives. Historians examining the broader collapse of the Ardennes offensive have consistently identified the failure of Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army to achieve the kind of breakthrough Peiper's early advance had briefly seemed to promise as one of the decisive early indicators that the offensive as a whole would fail to achieve its objectives, a judgment reached even before the parallel failure of American forces to break at Elsenborn Ridge and Bastogne had fully confirmed the broader pattern of German setbacks unfolding across the entire front. For Peiper personally, the collapse of his Kampfgruppe becomes, alongside the Malmedy massacre his forces committed in the offensive's opening hours, one of the two defining episodes of his entire wartime career, a story that historians and military analysts have studied for decades since, as a case study in the catastrophic risks inherent to any offensive plan built around the assumption that captured enemy supplies will substitute for a force's own adequate logistics. Peiper himself survives the war, later tried and convicted for his role in the Malmedy massacre, before eventually being released, living out his remaining years, attempting, with limited success, to distance his personal reputation from the atrocity that would forever overshadow whatever tactical skill he demonstrated during the desperate, ultimately doomed advance toward the Meuse. Military planners in the decades following the war have consistently cited Kampfgruppe Peiper's fuel crisis as one of the starkest illustrations in modern military history of how even the most tactically skilled, aggressively led armored formation can be rendered entirely combat ineffective, not by superior enemy firepower, but by the simple, unglamorous failure of logistics to keep pace with operational ambition. Staff colleges and military academies studying armored warfare continue to teach the Peiper episode as a foundational case study precisely because it illustrates, with such unusual clarity, the gap that can open between tactical execution and strategic planning when an operation's entire logistical foundation rests on assumptions about enemy behavior, in this case, that American forces would leave their fuel depots intact and capturable, that the enemy has every reason and every capability to simply refuse to honor. What the story of Kampfgruppe Peiper's collapse near Stavelot ultimately reveals is a truth that echoes across the entire history of mechanized warfare, that an army's fuel supply is every bit as decisive a weapon as its tanks, its guns, or the skill and courage of the men who crew them, and that no amount of battlefield aggression can compensate for a logistics plan built on hope rather than certainty. Modern military doctrine, shaped in no small part by the lessons drawn from episodes like Kampfgruppe Peiper's collapse, treats fuel and ammunition resupply as every bit as central to operational planning as the selection of objectives or the disposition of combat forces. An emphasis on logistics that traces a direct intellectual lineage back to the burned-out king tigers, left sitting silent in the forests above the Meuse River in the final days of December 1944. Hitler's planners gambled Germany's last significant mobile armored reserve on the assumption that American fuel depots would fall intact into German hands at precisely the moments and places German timetables required, and when American soldiers and engineers denied them that fuel, destroying stockpiles at Spa, demolishing bridges at Trois Ponts, fighting delaying actions at Stavelot that cost precious hours no German timetable could afford to lose. An entire offensive's fate was decided not in a single dramatic battle, but in the slow, grinding arithmetic of gallons burned against gallons available. The individual American soldiers and engineers responsible for these delaying actions and demolitions rarely receive the same historical attention as the generals whose names appear on the broader campaign maps, yet a compelling case can be made that a handful of engineers at Trois Ponts and the officers who ordered the Spa depot burned rather than risk its capture, altered the trajectory of the entire Ardennes offensive as decisively as any single division-level engagement fought elsewhere along the front that December. The most feared tanks in the German arsenal, machines capable of shrugging off nearly any American gun fired against them, sat silent and abandoned in the forests above the Meuse, not because they were beaten in battle, but because the fuel that gave them life simply ran out. A lesson that every army fielding tanks, planes or ships has been forced to relearn in every war since, that the tank that cannot move is no tank at all. From the deserts of North Africa decades later to the plains of Eastern Europe in conflicts still unfolding in the 21st century, the same fundamental truth, Kampfgruppe Peiper's collapse, demonstrated in the snow-covered forests above Stavelot, continues to assert itself whenever a commander mistakes the raw power of a weapon for the certainty of the fuel and supply required to bring that power to bear.